I'm here in Washington, D.C. in front of our nation's capital, and I thought, what better time to do a Roots documentary on the history of the Star-Spangled Banner. Now, I'm sure all of you know the Star-Spangled Banner, and you probably know every word to it, but you might not know the full story of Francis Scott Key and a man named William Beanes, who had been captured under British control and was really the whole reason that Francis Scott Key went there in the first place. So without further ado, this is the story of the Star-Spangled Banner. In order to appreciate the year of 1814, you have to understand what was happening leading up to that moment. Obviously, America declared independence in 1776, but honestly, after declaring independence, it just kind of pissed off the British even more. They really hated the notion of America being free without them. In fact, not only did they hate the notion, but they refused to accept it. We all know that that resulted in the Revolutionary War, which America ultimately won. Britain admitted defeat, only to rebuild their militia and come back even stronger for a second chance at destroying America. America was absolutely thriving. In the early 1800s, President Jefferson purchased the Louisiana Territory, which nearly doubled the size of the U.S. So the territories in America were growing, the militia was growing, people were beginning to thrive, and Britain absolutely hated seeing this. They hated seeing America win. So Britain started doing things to make the life of the average American pretty hard. They started restricting America's trade routes through Europe, and they also started capturing their seamen and putting them on their warships to work. For the British to just be stealing and kidnapping these people at sea and then forcing them to work on British warships, this was completely unacceptable. Between 1807 and 1812, the British captured over thousands of American seamen. In 1809, just a few years after the British started doing this, President Madison was sworn into office. President Madison was well aware of the tensions between the colonies and Britain, and he made it his very first priority to put America first and to make America great again. That door was wide open. At this time in 1809, America only had about 16 warships. Compare that to the Royal Navy, which had over 500. So naturally, going up against Britain was not going to be easy. America had fewer men, America had fewer weapons, and America had a significantly fewer amount of warships. But after 3 years of Madison's term, and after 3 years of the British taking these seamen and forcing them to work on their British warships, President Madison had no choice but to declare war with Britain in 1812. Many people were against this war. They had just come out of the Revolutionary War. They were tired. The economy was struggling. They did not want to go into another war. The good news is that this war would not be as bloody, and it also would not be as long as the Revolutionary War. But don't be mistaken, because it was just as significant, if not more. Now, this time in the War of 1812 was a little different from the Revolutionary War. Britain now understood America's fighting techniques, and they understood America's weaknesses. They came on the offense, whereas in the Revolutionary War, they were playing a lot of defense at times, and they were ready for revenge. On August 24th, 1814, exactly where I'm sitting speaking to you today, the British stormed the U.S. Capitol, Washington, D.C. They took torches and ran through the Capitol building that you see behind me. The Capitol was not fully built, obviously. It only had 2 wings at that point. But they came through and they burned every piece of it that they could. They also burned the White House, the Library of Congress, the House, the Senate, a Navy yard, and also an entire fleet of American warships, which was a huge blow to America. Like I said, they did not have that many warships to begin with. After they torched Washington, D.C. and looted everything in sight, they planted hundreds of their men on the east coast of Maryland. They also started going from town to town, torching the towns and terrorizing the citizens. Leading up to this raid, the British had already been in the area. In fact, they were operating from a citizen's house named William Beanes. Now, William Beanes was a die-hard American, so don't get me wrong and don't get the wrong idea when I say he was lending out his house to the British Army to operate in. Many people believed that William Beanes was actually a spy for the British and that he was lending out his house to them so that he could listen to their conversations and then give intelligence back to America. I don't think any of that's been proven, but as the story unfolds, you'll see that the British thought that, and you'll see why. But in 1812, 1813 time period, the British were on U.S. soil. They were in a little town called Marlborough where William Beans lived. Now, William Beans, just to give you a little context on who he was born in the year 1749 in a really small town called Croom in Maryland. He grew up in a very affluent home and always aspired to be a doctor. But obviously, being in America in the 1700s, they had just gotten there. There were no established medical schools. So his family knew a very prominent doctor who had studied in Europe, and they brought that doctor over to America to mentor their son, William. It was like the equivalent of a PhD. As William grew up, he continued his studies with his mentor and became a very knowledgeable medical professional. Once the Revolutionary War broke out, William really wanted to help in the war efforts. So he packed up a bag and he started traveling from battleground to battleground, tending to the wounded soldiers. Eventually, in the year 1799, William settled down in Maryland in a town called Marlborough. He actually helped create what is known today as the Maryland State Medical Society. Now, William Beans was in his 60s when the War of 1812 started to break out. So he was not a young lad, but he was a very, very valuable asset to the community and to America. America was still not that big, only 13 colonies. When the British got to America around 1812 and they got to Marlborough, William Beans said to them, "Hey, I've got a really nice house. I don't mind if you use this house as an operation base for all of your strategy planning." The British thought that William Beans was just being really sympathetic to them. They thought that William Beans was possibly even on their side because William Beans had such a strong connection still to Britain because he was a medical professional. They thought, hey, okay, this is great. So for a few years, the British used his house as an office. In August of 1814, when they decided to raid Washington, D.C., that's where things started to change a little bit for William Beans and their office operations. After the torching of Washington, D.C., a few of the soldiers who were at William Beans' house told him that they were going to go out and run some errands. They went out and ended up looting a bunch of local farms, taking all of the farmers' food. One of the farms that they looted was actually the governor of Maryland, who was a friend of William Beans. The governor was absolutely irate that the British looted his farm and took all of his food. He released a very urgent message to the community asking anyone who knew anything about who these soldiers were to tell him who they were so that he could bring them to justice. Well, William Beans knew who they were because they were living with him and working from his house. So William Beans kind of put two and two together that all of these soldiers told him they were going to go run errands on this day, go try to find food, and then they come back, and then the farm got looted. So William Beans hears the desperate plea from the governor through word of mouth in the town. He goes to two of his friends who live close by, and he says to them, "I know who the soldiers are who looted the governor's farm. I would like your help to bring them to justice." His friends said, "Of course we'll help you," and they went back to William Beans' house with their rifles. And when the soldiers came back from whatever outing they were on that day, they put guns to the soldiers' heads and forced them into a county jail. One of the soldiers who had looted the farms and been arrested by William and his friends ended up escaping this jail. As soon as he escaped the jail, he went to the east coast of Maryland, where all of the British soldiers had planted their army and their warships, and he told the commanders that there was a man named William Beans who had arrested him and two other soldiers. Obviously, the British control was very upset about this. They went out, found William Beans and his two friends, and captured them as British prisoners. Just a few weeks after they were captured, the British decided to release William's friends, but they decided to keep William. They refused to let him go because at this point, they're convinced he's a spy, and that's why he was offering his house to the British Army to work from. Now, I don't know that William was a spy. He might have literally just been offering his house, but this became the situation. Once William's two friends were released from British control, they ran back and found a prominent lawyer in the area named Francis Scott Key. Francis Scott Key was 33 years old. He had a new wife and a few kids at this point. He would go on to have 11 children with his wife. They go back and they tell Francis Scott Key the British are refusing to let go of William Beans. Now, Francis Scott Key knew William Beans. He was clearly very upset that William had been captured and that they weren't letting him go, and he was very eager to help in any way that he could. I don't know if Francis Scott Key wrote to President Madison or if President Madison wrote to Francis Scott Key, but President Madison caught wind that William Beanes had been captured by the British. William Beanes was an essential part of this community. President Madison and Francis Scott Key speak to each other and decide that Francis Scott Key is the best man to go and negotiate the release of Beanes with the British. Obviously, he's a lawyer, he's a smooth talker, he's the best guy. Francis Scott Key ends up going to the British base with another man who was the head of prisoner exchange, and his name was Colonel John Skinner. Francis Scott Key and John Skinner go to the British base, and they end up speaking with the man himself who ordered the capture of Beanes and his friends, General Cockburn. I can't make this up. General Cockburn had also been the man who approved the looting and the torching of Washington, D.C. This is who they were dealing with. They went to him and to his base, and they ended up successfully negotiating the release of William Beanes. They were basically like, hey dude, he's not a spy. He's just a stupid guy who lent out his house to you and then decided to take matters into his own hands and capture your men. We're sorry, but he's a citizen. He's not part of the militia, so there's no reason why he should be captured. The British believed him and ultimately decided to release Dr. Beanes. I'm not clear if Francis Scott Key and John had also negotiated the release of other prisoners. It kind of sounds like they did. If anybody knows that detail, please comment. I'm under the impression it could have been a few other prisoners as well, because they're on the east coast of Maryland and they've got a line of warships. And underneath the warships, that's where they kept all of the American prisoners. So underneath there was Dr. Beanes, who was the only citizen, and a bunch of American militia who had been captured as prisoners of war as well. So Francis and John successfully negotiate this. They decide to go to the warships where all of the prisoners are being held and physically tell them the good news. They get onto the ship, they go underneath, and they see Dr. Beanes and all of the other prisoners down there. And they said, we have great news. We just negotiated this really great deal. Tomorrow or the next day, William, you're free, and possibly others too. But for sure, William, you're free. The prisoners were extremely excited and proud. This was a very high moment for them. Francis and John got off of the boat. They went down to the base to collect their things. Sorry, there was a leaf blower. Hopefully you didn't hear that. But they go down back to the base to get their things and to go home. Once they get to the base, though, the British Army men tell them to hold on a second, that they're not allowed to leave. Now, Francis and John were very surprised that they weren't allowed to leave. They had just negotiated this great deal they didn't understand. And he said, well, there's a catch. The British man said, we're still going to honor our deal, but it's all going to be academic after today, which meant that it really didn't matter. It was just kind of a moot point. Francis Scott Key said, what do you mean it doesn't matter after today? And the British Army man said, well, after today, the war is going to be over. He said, why is the war going to be over? And he said, well, we just gave the colonies an ultimatum. Either they lower that red, white, and blue flag and retire it for good, or we are going to absolutely destroy Fort McHenry. If you think of the game of Jenga, where you pull out one piece and the whole thing falls, that was like pulling out Fort McHenry. If they blew up Fort McHenry, that was the Jenga piece that would make everything else fall. This was a very pivotal moment in American history, because in this moment, if the British did succeed, it was pretty much over. And also keep in mind, this was right after they had torched and looted and destroyed Washington, D.C., chased President Madison out of the Capitol and his wife. So they were coming in strong. Francis Scott Key said, you wouldn't dare bomb Fort McHenry. And he said, look out there. Look at the horizon. Do you see all those little dots? And Francis Scott Key said, yes. He said, those are British warships. There's 500 of them out there, pointed right at Fort McHenry. He said, as soon as we see that American flag come down, we're going to cease fire. That flag is going to come down because they're not going to be able to take it. Either they can't take it or they're going to die, and the British are going to take down the flag themselves. So Francis Scott Key and John can't believe this news. They go back to the warships where they had just been so elated with this message of William Beanes being released. Now they have to tell all of the prisoners Fort McHenry is about to be destroyed. Once they go on, they tell the prisoners what's happening, and the prisoners say to him, well, how many ships are there? They can't see anything. They're locked underneath the ship. They said, well, how possible is it that they're actually going to be successful in this? How many warships are out there? And Francis Scott Key said, men, there's hundreds. There's hundreds, and they're all pointed right at the fort. Now, Fort McHenry, was enormous. And it wasn't just a military base. It also had women and children and citizens and was just an operational building. It wasn't just military people there. In fact, there were only about 1,000 men at Fort McHenry who were capable of defending it. Fort McHenry had always been a military fort. It was a military fort in the Revolutionary War as well. The base was originally built in the year 1798 and was used continuously as a military base all the way through World War II. It was named after a man named James McHenry, who lived from 1753 until 1816. McHenry was an Irish immigrant and a surgeon and a soldier. He was also one of the signers on the U.S. Constitution and served under George Washington and John Adams as Secretary of War. In the year of 1812, just 2 years before all of this is happening, they had raised an enormous 17-foot by 25-foot flag over the fort. That's the flag that the British were saying must come down, and as soon as it comes down, they cease fire, or they kill everyone and take it down themselves. Now, from where Francis Scott Key and John were on the warships, they could make out the flag and they could make out the horizon, but they couldn't see what was happening, but they could vaguely hear it. At 6 a.m. on September 13th, 1814, the British unleashed the most merciless attack on Fort McHenry. Francis Scott Key and John were both absolutely in awe at how horrible this bombardment was. Just imagine 500 ships firing all at once at 6 o'clock in the morning. Francis Scott Key immediately went down below the ship where all of the prisoners and beans were locked up and told them that the fighting had begun. They kept asking, how possible is this? Like, how many are there? How much is this? Francis Scott Key and John told the prisoners that this was the worst bombardment they had ever witnessed or heard or could even fathom happening. An hour went by of just continuous bombing. Then another hour went by, then 3. Now it's almost lunchtime, and Francis Scott Key comes down to where the prisoners are and has to tell them the British are still unleashing bombs on Fort McHenry. Now keep in mind too, where Francis Scott Key and John were, they couldn't exactly make out if these bombs and guns were making direct hits on the fort or not. So they had no idea how many people were being injured by this. And if it was everyone or if it was just a few people, if people were running, they had no idea. All they could see were the rockets' red glare and the bombs bursting in the air. They just knew that it was really, really brutal. Now, the Americans and the British both had a problem with this battle. The main problem was that cannons and guns only had a certain range that they could go. It was like 2 miles. The British were on their warships on sea. They weren't doing a land attack. So their cannons and their guns could only go so far to land. And same with the Americans who were trying to return fire. Their guns and their cannons could also only go so far. So Francis Scott Key and John didn't know this at the time, but those bombs that were just bursting in air were doing that because they weren't actually making it to land. So neither side was really receiving enormous fire. They were receiving, a few bombs and a few guns, but it could have been so much worse if they had been closer and if those cannons and guns had reached just a little bit further. Now, one of the bombs did land on Fort McHenry and it killed a woman who was bringing food to the troops, and another soldier also died. But other than that, neither side received too many deaths. It was actually not that bloody of a battle. It was just really long. 10 hours goes by. 11, 12. Throughout this whole time, as Fort McHenry is just being continuously attacked, Francis Scott Key keeps coming down to where the prisoners are to report back. Every time Francis Key went down, the prisoners would ask, "What's the flag doing? What's the flag doing? Is the flag still there? Is it still there?" Because they knew that as soon as that flag came down, it was over. Everything they had fought for, the Declaration of Independence, would be obsolete. And nothing would matter if that flag came down, if either America surrendered or the British killed everyone there and took it down themselves. And each time Francis Scott Key came down, he said, "It's still there. It's still there. It's still there." Once nighttime started to fall, Francis Scott Key could not make out if the flag was there or not. It was around 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning when silence fell upon the ships. They used to hear the bombing and the cannons and the guns in the distance, And suddenly, everything stopped. Francis Scott Key said that once that happened, all he could hear were the waves hitting the ship and the prisoners underneath praying to God, God, please let that flag still be there where we saw it in the morning. Please let the flag still be there. Please let it still be there. Let the flag still be there in that same spot. The moment that dawn broke, Francis Scott Key went up on top of the ship to see if the flag was still there. And in that moment, he started to cry because the flag was not there. But the flag that was there was an even bigger and newer American flag than what had been there previously. In the middle of the night, the battle had ceased. The British ran out of ammunition, and the Americans had won. They replaced the battered, torn flag that was covered in soot from the constant bombs, cannons, and guns that had hit it for over a day. They replaced it with an even bigger, newer American flag. Francis Scott Key went down to the men and told them what he saw. And all of the men started to cry. There's a quote by George Washington that says, what separates Americans from everyone else is the fact that they're willing to die on their feet than live on their knees. It's a quote that all of the soldiers kept really close to their hearts during these battles, and a concept that lives on through today. These men weren't just fighting for their own freedom. They were fighting for the freedom of their sons and their daughters, and for every generation that would come after them. Francis Scott Key was so moved by this moment, he took out some paper. He started to write a poem that he called The Defense of Fort McHenry. Oh, say can you see by the dawn's early light, what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars, through the perilous fight, over the ramparts we watched, were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say, does that star-spangled banner wave over the land of the free and the home of the brave? There are more stanzas to the song that I'm going to read right now. On the shore dimly seen through the mists of the deep, where the foe's haughty host in dread silence reposes, what is that which the breeze over the towering steep, as it fitfully blows, half conceals, half discloses? Now it catches the gleam of the morning's first beam, in full glory reflected, now shines in the stream. 'Tis the star-spangled banner, oh long may it wave, over the land of the free and the home of the brave. And where is that band who so vauntingly swore that the havoc of war and the battle's confusion, a home and a country should leave us no more? Their blood has washed out their foul footsteps' pollution. No refuge could save the hireling and slave from the terror of flight or the gloom of the grave. And the star-spangled banner in triumph doth wave over the land of the free and the home of the brave. Oh, thus be it ever when free men shall stand between their loved home and the war's dissolution. Blessed with victory and peace, may the heaven-rescued land praise the power that hath made and preserved us a nation. Then conquer we must, when our cause it is just, and this be our motto, in God is our trust. And the star-spangled banner in triumph shall wave over the land of the free and the home of the brave. I know so many times you're at a football game or a soccer game or a concert and they sing this first stanza of the Star-Spangled Banner, but those lyrics in the first stanza are so true to what was happening, because he was going up on top of the ship looking for the flag every hour, every minute of every hour, watching if the flag was still there. And yes, as twilight started to end and night started to fall, the only way he could make out if the flag was there was by the red glare coming off of the rockets. It wasn't until the British ran out of ammunition and it was completely dark that he couldn't tell, and the men were profusely praying to God that it be there in the morning. Also, the line over the ramparts we watched, a rampart is a wall, and they were on all of the British warships where the prisoners were underneath, and there were walls over them. And that's what he means by that one line. I just thought I'd clarify that. And I know that sometimes people question the role that God should play in our country and the separation of church and state. Hearing these stories and reading these letters and realizing the power that the Holy Spirit had to have over this country for it to withstand so many attacks and so many trials. There's no way that we could be the country that we are without God and without his power. And I think you really can see that in his last stanza where he says, "Blessed with victory and peace may the heaven-rescued land praise the power that hath made and preserved us a nation. Then conquer we must, when our cause it is just, and this be our motto, in God is our trust." Now, the melody to the national anthem was a very old English song. There's some rumors out there that it was a drinking song, which might be a little true. It was a song that would be sung in the men's society in London in the early 1700s. So who knows what those men were doing in the early 1700s, but they had a little ditty and it went dun 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 dun. Apparently, this rumor that it was a drinking song came about because this song would be played when the men's society would be transitioning from evening dinners to like nighttime party scene, nighttime, like it was just kind of like the transition from a formal dinner to like a club setting. If you think of like bars, how a lot of bars in downtown areas will be dinner restaurants, and then around like 10 o'clock, they switch, they like move out the tables, turn off the lights, turn on fun lights, and make it a club. Like a lot of places do that in like New York and Chicago and whatnot. It was kind of like that, but that song would be played, think of it this way, that song would be played as the restaurant is clearing out the dinner tables, turning off the lights, and putting on the cool lights and cool music. The melody was super popular, and it was actually used all the way through the 18th and 19th century. There were actually lyrics that went to that tune. The name of the original song with that melody, dun 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 dun, was called the Anacreontic song. It was written and titled as a theme song to the Men's Society, and the Men's Society was called the Anacreontic Society. They were named after the Greek poet Anacreon, who lived from 570 to 485 BC. To Anacreon in heaven, where he sat in full glee, a few sons of harmony sent a petition that he their inspirer and patron would be. When this answer arrived from the jolly old Grecian, voice, fiddle, and flute no longer be mute. I'll lend you my name and inspire you to boot. And besides, I'll instruct you like me to entwine the myrtle of Venus with Bacchus's vine. And then it kind of goes on, like Apollo gets up there, then we have like some other players who come in. So I will link the YouTube video of this song so that you can actually listen to the original song. And I will also link the website to the lyrics so you can go and read every stanza for yourself. Now, like I said, this song was very, very popular. It was used all the way through the 18th and 19th centuries. In 1798, the song made its way to the new country of America when a man named Robert Paine wrote new lyrics for the 4th anniversary of the Massachusetts Charitable Fire Society. He called this song Atoms and Liberty, "Ye sons of Columbia who bravely have fought for those rights which unstained from your sires had descended. May you long taste the blessings your valor has brought, and your sons reap the soil which their fathers defended. Mid the reign of mild peace may your nation increase, with the glory of Rome and the wisdom of Greece. And never shall the sons of Columbia be slaves, while the earth bears a plant or the sea rolls its waves. In a clime whose rich vales feed the marts of the world, whose shores are unshaken by Europe's commotion. The trident of commerce should never be hurled to incense the legitimate powers of the ocean. But should pirates invade, though in thunder arrayed, let your cannon declare the free charter of trade. For never shall the sons of Columbia be slaves, while the earth bears a plant or the sea rolls its waves. The fame of our arms, of our laws, the mild sway,
had justly ennobled our nation and story, till the dark clouds of faction obscured our young day and enveloped the sun of American glory. But let traitors be told who their country have sold and bartered their God for his image in gold, that never shall the sons of Columbia be slaves while the earth bears a plant or the sea rolls its waves. While France her huge limbs bathes recumbent in blood, and society's base threats with wide dissolution, may peace like the dove who returned from the flood find an ark of abode in our mild constitution. But though peace is our aim, yet the boon we disclaim, if bought by our sovereignty, justice, or fame. For never shall the sons of Columbia be slaves, while the earth bears a plant or the sea rolls its waves. 'Tis the fire of the flint each American warms. Let Rome's haughty victors beware of collision. Let them bring all the vassals of Europe in arms. We're a world by ourselves and disdain a division. While the patriot pride to our laws were allied, no foe can subdue us, no faction divide. For never shall the sons of Columbia be slaves, while the earth bears a plant or the sea rolls its waves. Our mountains are crowned with imperial oak, whose roots, like our liberties, ages have nourished. But lone ever our nation submits to the yoke, not a tree shall be left on the field where it flourished. Should invasion impend, every grove would descend, from the hilltops they shaded our shores to defend. For never shall the sons of Columbia be slaves, while the earth bears a plant and the sea rolls its waves. Let our patriots destroy anarch's pestilent worm, lest our liberty's growth should be checked by corrosion. Then let clouds thicken round us, we heed not the storm. Our realm fears no shock but the earth's own explosion. Foes assail us in vain, though their fleets bridge the main. From our altars and laws with our lives we'll maintain. Should the tempest of war overshadow our land, its bolts could never rend freedom's temple asunder. For unmoved at its portal would Washington stand and repulse with his breast the assaults of the thunder. His sword from the sleep of its scabbard would leap and conduct with its point every flash to the deep. For never shall the sons of Columbia be slaves, while the earth bears a plant and the sea rolls its waves. Let fame to the world sound America's voice. No intrigues can her sons from their government sever. Her pride is her atoms, her laws are his choice, and shall flourish till liberty slumbers forever. Then unite heart and hand, like Leonidas's band, and swear to the God of the ocean and land, that never shall the sons of Columbia be slaves, while the earth bears a plant or the sea rolls its waves.
After this battle of Fort McHenry, Francis Scott Key's poem became the new lyrics to the song and to that melody, and ultimately became pegged the national anthem. So I hope that the next time you hear the national anthem, you take off your hat and you put your hand on your heart and you thank God for everything that he's done to protect this nation and our freedom. I hope you guys liked today's Roots documentary. If podcasts are more your style, I'm also on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. And if you'd like to join the Roots Music History family, you can become a Roots Music History member. I'll put in a little blurb about the membership in case you're not familiar with it and other ways that you can get involved in the channel. But until then, I'll see you on the next Roots documentary.
Did you know you can become a Roots Music History member? Right next to the subscribe button is a button that says join. There are 3 different membership tiers that you can choose from. Level 1 will give you access to loyalty badges. Depending on how long you have been a subscriber for, you will be granted a loyalty badge. If you've been a subscriber for 1 full month, you'll get 1 music note, 2 months, 2 music notes, all the way up to a year, which will grant you record status. You will also get access to emojis for comments and early access to new videos. For level 2, you'll get all the perks of level 1 plus the text messaging service. You will be notified every time a new Roots documentary is in progress. You will also be notified via text every time a video is posted. If you have a special request for the next Roots documentary, you can also text Roots Music History's production team at the same phone number that you're receiving the text alerts from. And then the level 3 membership is the greatest membership of all. Not only will will you get all of the perks of level 1 and level 2, but you will also be entitled to exclusive bonus features. That includes backstage passes to certain shows here in Nashville, Tennessee, tours around Nashville and Music Row, complete with little tidbits of history here and there, and live music streams. You will also get access to the full newspaper articles that are mentioned in the videos. You'll be able to read them as posts or listen to them as articles. There will also be videos where I'm just reading the newspaper articles. Every third Thursday, if you are a level 3 member, you can also join the other members of the Roots Music History Club and myself as we do a live coffee chat, Thursdays at 10 a.m. Central Time. If you'd like to represent Roots music at the grocery store, or even if you're just on your couch watching a Roots rockumentary, then check out the Roots Music History merchandise store. You can get a tank top, a t-shirt, a hat, a mug, a bag, a bandana for your dog. So on the next Roots rockumentary, you can be drinking your wine from a Roots Music History wine glass, or you can join our coffee chats with your Roots Music History mug. You can also just simply say thanks every time you watch a video if you are thankful for the content or if you learned something that you didn't know about. At the bottom of every video, there should be a button that says thanks. If you click that button, then you have the option to donate anywhere from $2 all the way up to $500 to Roots Music History. Of course, subscribing is free, and subscribing to the channel is the best free way to promote Roots Music History to other people on the YouTube platform. You have no idea how helpful it is just to have one extra subscriber, one extra thumbs up and or a comment. Having a comment, a thumbs up, and a subscribe does wonders for the YouTube algorithm, and it pushes the video up in the queue so that other people are more likely to come across it and be able to watch it. You can also find Roots Music History on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. And of course, I will see you on the next Roots rockumentary.
You feel what I feel, we're made the same, and that's real, babe. We won the whole game.